My name is Chloe Lum, and I do programming for Volume Montreal, which is an art book fair in Montreal. And first, I'd like to acknowledge that Volume Montreal is based on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation are recognized as the traditional custodians of the lands that we operate from. Shoshone Montreal is historically recognized as the gathering place of many First Nations. Today it is the home of a diverse group of Indigenous people and settlers. So for today's reading, we are joined by Tanya Lukin Linklater, whose performances, works for camera, installations, and writings have been shown at SFMOMA, Chicago Architecture Biennial, the EFA Project Space and Performa, Art Gallery of Ontario, Crystal Bridges Museums of American Art, the Remai Modern, the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and elsewhere. She will participate in Soft Water, Hard Stone, the 2021 New Museum Triennial. Her collection of poetry, Slow Scrapes, was published by the Center for Expanded Poetics and Anteism in 2020, with a second printing in 2021. And that is the book that she will be reading from this evening. Tanya studied at the University of Alberta and Stanford University. In 2021, she received the Herb Alpert Award in the arts for visual art and was longlisted for the Sobey Art Award. She is currently a doctoral candidate in cultural studies at Queen's University. Her Alutiiq homelands are in southwestern Alaska, where much of her family continues to live. After her reading, Tanya will be joined in conversation with poet and editor Michael Nardone. And afterwards, we can take a couple questions from the audience if there should be any. And I will put it over to Tanya. Thank you.
I just want to thank you for the introduction, Chloe, and for inviting me to read for Volume Montreal. And I'm wondering if I'm on full screen or if yeah, there we go. Okay, great. I also just want to acknowledge that I live and work in the BC Anishinaabe territory in Northern Ontario, and that's where I'm reading from this evening. And I'm going to begin with a very small text. It's a very concise text that speaks a little bit about who I am as a Shukbiak or a Alutiiq person. And it's titled Shuk. Shuk, a human being. Afognac dialect, the S is pronounced sh. It sounds like shook, but with a shorter O. Perhaps we shake, or past tense, we shook. When are we shaken? And I suppose that sort of opening text also speaks to the sort of central question of the collection of poetry. And that question is, how do we traverse the slow scrape of time? And that's very present for me throughout this book in terms of considering personal memory, considering familial community and historical memories as well. So I thought I'd start the reading with a couple of texts that came about originally in 2012, 2013. And at the time I was in mentorship with Layli Longsoldier, who's a really brilliant poet and a friend of mine. And we were meeting regularly, I think weekly. She was in Arizona on the Navajo Reservation, and I was at Nipissing First Nation. We met weekly, and she encouraged me to write about what was urgent for me at the time. And at the time, Chief Teresa Spence had undertaken or began her 44-day hunger strike or fast in relation to treaty. So this was an embodied action that was a call for a response from the Canadian government, and I think beyond as well, as it's in relation to treaty. And I wanted to respond to this action that she was undertaking. So Chief Teresa Spence is from Ottawa-Piscat First Nation. She's Omuskego Cree from James Bay, Ontario. And I have relatives, extended relatives who are Omuskego Cree, sort of immediate and extended relatives. And the way in which I felt that I could begin to be in relation to Chief Spence was to undertake a series of interviews with these relatives, and they're Agnes Hunter, Marlene Kepeshisit, and Lillian Trapper. And I asked them a series of questions about their lives, although I didn't really fully realize when I started to ask them questions what it is I was asking. I was asking about their lived experience and the way that they learned how to bead or how to tan hides or how to sew. But the more that we visited, the more that it became apparent that they were, as a part of these practices, they were cultivating these really deep and beautiful inner lives. And so I want to start with the first text, which is Nokum, sort of in preparation. And I do apologize if there's sound in the background. I have children and they may make some sound. I'm going to ask them to be quiet. 1 second. So this is called Nokum, and it begins in this way. Her hands that cradle caribou, hide, sinew, all manners of beads, fur. My hands crouch inside the space she presses between her fingers, inside the space resting in her palms. Do you remember when you asked me to be your grandmother? I bend at the waist, wrap my arms around her shoulders, resting against the wheelchair. Yes, my sound to her ear. "44 days. At 21 days on the eve of the new year on Unmelted River, I watch until night, fearful of what might come. 44 days. She relents, stays with us. She is not spent. She continues. Now that number and she know one another." And so this next text is the longer text called The Harvest Dirties. And I'm going to read excerpts of it. Cheap memory foam cushions a cheaper mattress. Under goose down comforter and flannel, I'm wrapped, composing before I open my eyes. There's a woman whose name means to harvest, to provide. A crimson ribbon skirt to ground, a down coat, tanned moose hide mitts braided with yarn rested her sides, held at her neck. Moose hide smoked and tanned collide with red and white beads. Those hands pluck geese, chop wood, snare rabbits, stoke fires, lay spruce boughs for warmth. The harvest dirties. Here, I bleach black mold lines on window frames, scrub the septic tank toilet, wash, rewash bathroom countertops. He pine saws the floors, stacks rugs on deck snow. Together we dust, scrub, bleach to prepare our home for visitors. From a hand-me-down couch through the window, an ice fishing hut appears, driven by a truck I can't see. It hovers on a dirt road to launch onto the frozen lake. This view from our 900 square foot home on someone else's First Nation. Surrounded by blankets hanging inside raw canvas and scraped trees, spruce boughs on ground to insulate, she rests. A wood stove pipe creaks towards December sun. The girls crouch on unthawed land near a fire. She sits mantled in blankets against wintry damp. She listens as they speak about a day when every child in Canada feels they are worth something. I watch as she brings her lips to each cheek and brow, and I plot a line for her as these James Bay mitts rest at her neck. To harvest, provide, dispense, she enters her 21st day, the eve of a new year on the unmelted river. Mitts, Astasak, women, Iskwewak. James Bay Astasak, worked by women's hands Astasak, and from the life of an animal you say it's a year to fix a moose hide or longer. Your hands clip, scrape, wring, stretch, wash, tan, smoke. Your hands work hides, beads, fur linings, stitches, thread, cloth. Both your hands work these objects that aren't objects. Astasak warm the hands of Awasasak, Napewak, Iskwewak on this land, Astasak. Women who work in this way, mothers, grandmothers, aunties, I'm telling you. I don't know this work. Nimbly, James Bay Iskwewak craft Astasak. Swiftly they sew Astasak. Astasak in repetition they stitch. Swift repetition they clothe their families. Nokum, I call you. Ask about sewing mitts. Instead, you tell me you grew up in a teepee on the land, in the bush near Hudson Bay, 200 miles from Pewanik. Your dad hunted caribou, trapped beaver, otter, mink, and nowadays the young men trap martens. Years ago in my mother-in-law's kitchen, you fried caribou with onions, ruddy on a spring afternoon in Timmins. After tea and visits in your daughter's house, I told you my grandmother passed away. I was only 7. I can be your grandmother, you said. Now as we talk on the phone, you and Pewanik, me on Lake Nipissing, I wonder why I never asked you more. I waited so long, nearly 80 this May, and you can't cook in the teepee nor teach the kids how to snare or to speak Cree, but you sew fierce and scrub the floors from your wheelchair. So for those of you who can't see the book or haven't read the book or haven't seen some of the installations that accompany this text, I'm using direct quotations. So I use direct quotes, not in all instances, but in a few. They need to understand the whole concept of our craftsman, Auntie. So it's done like this, Tanya. Seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread. Astasak, maskasina. Seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread. Petal, leaf, stem, yellow, purple, green. Daughter and son and daughter. Petal, leaf, stem, yellow, purple, green. Seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread. Astasak, maskasina. Seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread, needle, hem, seam, thread. Instead, with accent hues of moss and lavender shades of rose, I follow a map of syllabics. I write on Atikawayan and build my lines like this. Nokum nanek, iskwewak, iskwewak, iskwewak. Aski, 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 aski. When it's my own time, my own sewing, my own ways, it's like I go into a little place of my own, Auntie. Practice, 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 practice. A stitch, a bead, another stitch, repeat. A stitch, a bead, another stitch, repeat. A stitch, a bead, another stitch, repeat. A bead, a stitch, another stitch, repeat. A stitch, a bead, another stitch, repeat. Hands deft, every stitch straight, each bead nimble, repeat. Hands deft, every stitch straight, each bead nimble, repeat. Hands deft, every stitch straight, each bead nimble, repeat. Hands. Gentle, gentle, very gentle, repeat. Gentle, gentle, very gentle, repeat. Gentle, gentle, very. You connect with your loved ones. For me, I connect with my mom. It's my mom and grandma, mostly my mom though, and my aunties. I have their patterns, their mitts, their slippers. I pull them out, I look at them. I see her writing. I can see the style of my aunts. I can see the style of my mom, and these papers are little whittled now. They're just thinning out. You start thinking about them, it's healing. It brings real comfort in your soul when you're sewing. I get a lot of comfort. That's why when things go on, I'm gonna go do some sewing. I go in another world. It's hard to explain just with you and God. You're thinking, you're praying, your mind goes. You're in another atmosphere. I don't let it go. I won't let it go. Smoke of the canvas skirt you bind on a tikawayan in the cook teepee eddies. We spark the spongy wood for this last part you show me over the phone, Nokum. Raising one delicate bead from the cache, I fire the caribou broom, turn it over in my mind as I cannot see its texture, weight, color, the light. You say only 3 or 4 left in Pewanak and perhaps 2 in Fort Severn know how to fix the hide of a tick. Nokum, I am not with you. So that ends the Harvest Dirties. I might mention that it's sort of began many years of different kinds of works, performances, text installations that became scores for performance. My dog's going outside. And also a number of other works, works for camera, installations now of Nokum scarf sculptures, which is something that that's what I call them. And this is sort of gesturing towards this embodied knowledge that grandmothers and aunties have from the land and that lived experience that they have in relation to the land. It's really about sort of citing that knowledge, I guess, in an academic way, but really it's about being in relation and learning from our relatives more than anything. So I'm going to move us now back to event scores. So I also, as a part of this collection of poetry, I've included a number of event scores that I wrote primarily in the spring of 2016. And they're largely, but not solely, focused on my homelands. And so I'm just going to take you through a number of them. And you'll notice that there are a number of names in the titles, and that's because I'm citing Indigenous thinkers and writers, artists and dancers, with some of my own family members or community members as well. An event score for Indigenous epistemologies, Ebhampton. A person enters and reads, the audience listens but does not look. Then the audience looks only to follow with its body. Then the audience body turns to the east. Then the audience holds its heart. Then the audience listens but does not look. An event score for Haunting, Ellutic. A person enters and reads, the audience remembers relentlessly, then the audience feels no ease. Then what can decolonization mean other than the return of stolen land? Then what must it feel like to be haunted? An event score, 1 second. Sorry, I just seem to have the most active dog in the world this evening, so I apologize. An event score for Maria Tallchief, Dylan Robinson, and Sherry Farrell-Rissette. A person enters and says, the museum or gallery exerts a force in its looking. Then the look of a choreographer is like an everyday structure that exerts a force alongside the body of a dancer. Then our bodies exert a force. Then our objects exert a force. Then when do our bodies' forces exceed the look of a choreographer? Then when do our objects' forces exceed the look of the museum or gallery? So this is a longer event score, and it's for Kodiak Alutiiq. And Helen Semyonov, who is in the title, is my late relative. An event score for Kodiak Alutiiq 1, Helen Semyonov. An Ellutic person enters and says, this event score is longer than most. My job is to tell, your job is to listen. Listen to the quiet around the words. Listen for the sparse and melancholic. Then Alphonse Pinart collected Alutiiq masks on our island in 1872 and took them to France. Then, over a century later, Helen Semyonov, our relative, traveled from Kodiak Island to the masks held in a collection in France. She was the first. Then many Alutiiq traveled from Kodiak Island to the masks held in a collection in France. They tell us that when they touched the masks, they wept. Then the Alutiiq masks eventually traveled back to Kodiak Island, but only because we had an Alutiiq museum to exhibit them, and only if we promised to never repatriate the masks. Then the promise was made and vitrines were built. Then we looked at the masks behind glass. Some masks we quickly looked away from. Which masks were we supposed to see? Mostly we looked at the texts alongside the masks that attempted to tell us what the masks meant. Then we felt the masks when we looked at them. Then we felt the masks when we touched them. Then we think about the text remnants behind glass placed next to the masks left by Alphonse Pinart, and all that was held in our people before he ever traveled to our island to collect. Then we exceed the text remnants in Pinart's translations of our songs and dances from Alutiiq to Russian, to English, to French, and back again. Then we exceed the Alphonse Pinart collection of Alutiiq masks. This work is really significant for me because I've been thinking about our relationship to the museum and to collections, and even to archaeology, anthropology, and ethnography since I was very young. I think I was the first youth intern in the Ellutic Museum, which opened, I think, in 1995 or 1996. And it was really formative for me when I was very young. You know, I feel quite comfortable being in collection storage spaces generally as a result of that time that I spent at the Ellutic Museum. But also at a very young age, I understood this relationship of our people and our efforts to repair and recover ourselves that was somehow bound up in anthropology and in collections, and in this work that I've come to understand as partially learning about who we are through decipherment and discernment of these materials that were left to us by our ancestors. So I've undertaken a number of works over time in relation to these histories specifically, very clearly in 2016 and subsequently, but perhaps earlier as well. So the second event score for Kodiak Alutiiq is to Alice Herlicka, and I don't want to give too much space to Alice Herlicka, but I do want to say that as a result of his actions on our island, specifically in the native village of Larsen Bay, we had to undertake a sort of very large effort to repatriate ancestral remains home. While I'm not from the village of Larsen Bay, certainly in the 90s, well, it started earlier than that, but this repatriation, which involved the Smithsonian and Alutiiq people being involved in congressional hearings for the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was also a really sort of significant event for our community at large, but also sort of in my memory is very clear. An event score for Kodiak Alutiiq 2 to Alice Herlicka. An Alutiiq person enters and says, "We exceed the archaeological site." Then we exceed the discipline formation of anthropology. Then we exceed the structures imposed on us. An event score for the epistemic violence of translation, Edgar Heap of Birds. 1. A person enters and speaks in Alutiiq. 2. A person enters and speaks in Alutiiq. The audience listens. And so now I'm going to move us to my village, specifically my ancestral village of Afognac. I'm enrolled in 2 villages, Afognac, which is my ancestral village, and Port Lions, which is where I continue to visit and much of my family continues to live in. An event score for Afognac Alutiiq 1 to 3, abridged. An Alutiiq person enters and says, "Our memory marks Afognac. Afognac marks us. What are we tethered to? What holds us together? When I am home on our island, I sense that the land exudes grief, this feeling. Many of us have left the land of our ancestors, perhaps because the grief becomes unbearable." An event score for Afognac Alutiiq 4. An Alutiiq person enters and tells a story about Afognac. The audience listens. Then someone tells a related story. and so on, and so on, and so on, and so. Shook, a human being. Afognac dialect, the S is pronounced shh. It sounds like shook, but with a shorter O. Perhaps we shake, or past tense, we shook. When are we shaken? So I'm going to end with a work, sort of a longer poem called They Fall the Ground Beneath You. And this poem is, very much about my homelands and historical memory, and has come to live in a work for camera that takes its title from the text called They Fall the Ground Beneath You, and was originally a response to a request from Candace Hopkins to respond to the work of Sonia Kelleher-Combs, who is just a really phenomenal artist. She's a Inupiaq and maybe also from other communities, but she's from Alaska, and I just deeply respect her practice and her work, and have actually come to know her since I undertook this project. Her work is often concerned with our relationship to land, to community. There are social justice components of it, and just this beautiful material practice that I just deeply, deeply respect. I say this even, perhaps you hear it resolute, or the words jump jagged at you. They fall the ground beneath you so that you are sliding on silt down the side of a bluff to mudflats, terrified but focused on one point, like the dust in the air, or a dog attached to a house on a leash that jumps with the will of land. I tell you that in places the ground becomes a mouth. Roofing tiles, gypsum, screws, curtains, glass, stainless steel mixing bowls, tufts of carpet kneaded with rock silt, snow, pussy willows, houses, unmade. A little girl sits on a car with her brother, a slide, a shift, a shove. Jagged earth undercurrent pulls to tide. They land, even, still, and quiet. Her oldest and smallest brother do not land. They become landed. The debris is eaten by the tides. What happens when the earth shocks, convulses, jars, when a seismic undulation is no longer a tremble, but a roll, a roar, a boom that does not end? One long percussive wreck, accelerating, but you do not know what speed or where or when it will halt. You see the fissure, rift, schism, splinter. What are these words tethered to as the breach fragments? What holds them together? All the silt sedimenting, powder settling. What are we tethered to when everything seems to collapse, shatter, erupt simultaneously? Afognac was destroyed by tsunamis. I say it for what it is. The weight of the words rolls in the empty spaces of my mouth. What are these words tethered to? My great uncle JP, the earthquake first, and the water started moving. My uncle Alan tells me that my grandfather Afognac Jr. was in his boat traveling back from Kodiak when the earth shook. My aunts and uncles Small were playing on the beach. Betty Nelson, the ground was just going in waves. I remember stepping over these waves even on the ground, and underneath your feet, it sounded like a freight train, going by, passing or something. It was terrible noise. She describes the eerie snowfall when the land halted. Victoria Nelson Woodward describes the erratic flying of birds, not a murmuration. Zenaida ran across Big Lake with Maria, 3 years old, on her back. As Zenaida and her 6 children ran across the lake, the ice broke up behind them. The ones they speak of, my grandmother, aunties, uncles, my father, my relatives. The people ran to the mountain. My dad remembers that when the people arrived on the mountain, wall tents sheltered the people. The people stayed on the mountain for 2 nights. On the 3rd day, they walked back down to the village. The creeks and lake had turned to salt water, driftwood amongst spruce trees. The community hall just complete, broken up, the water high in the houses. The land that was marked with square log cabins and sod homes, banyas, chicken coops, gardens, smokehouses, boats, nets, firewood, water pails, outhouses, boardwalks, snares, outboard motors, chainsaws, a church, a schoolhouse, the just completed community hall. What are we tethered to when everything seems to collapse simultaneously? The markings that we know are upended. Collapse has a longer mark, an enduring seismic wave in our memories. The Good Friday earthquake, also known or also called the Great Alaska Earthquake of March 27, 1964, was the most powerful earthquake in US history. The magnitude 9.2 earthquake resulted in 131 deaths and was centered in Prince William Sound. At 5:36 p.m. Alaska Standard Time, a fault between the Pacific and North American plates ruptured near College Fjord in Prince William Sound. The earthquake lasted 4 minutes in most areas. Ocean floor shifts created large tsunamis. Vertical displacement of up to 38 feet occurred, affecting an area of 100,000 square miles within Alaska. Downtown Anchorage was heavily damaged, and parts of the city built on clay or near bluff, most notably the Turnagain Heights neighborhood, suffered landslide damage. Most towns in the Prince William Sound, Kenai Peninsula, and Kodiak Island areas, especially the major ports of Seward and Kodiak, were heavily hit by a combination of seismic damage, tsunamis, subsidence, fire. Several of the smaller low-lying Alaska Native villages in the area, Chiniga and Afognac, were mostly or totally destroyed. Perry Mead was a neurosurgeon in Anchorage who lost his 2 children in the Great Alaska Earthquake at 5:36 p.m. on Good Friday, 1964. The Anchorage Daily News tells and retells the story 50 years later alongside the stories of children whose parents were at the salon near the new JCPenney store on 5th Avenue in Anchorage. These stories are turned over in our minds. They become the stories we remember because they are written, pressed, circulated in varying degrees of honesty. In one story, Perry Mead's oldest son was a hero and rescued the toddler boy. In another, the daughter remembers her oldest brother dragged both boys out of the house and threw them forward, then in terror ran back into a house that collapsed and was swallowed. This becomes a history. Collapse has a longer mark, an enduring seismic wave in our memories. Quiana, thank you. I just want to invite Michael to join me.
Thank you so much, Tanya. That was such an incredible reading and such a generous reading and telling of this book. It's the second time this week that I get to hear you read from this book after, you know, this book was launched in the middle of the pandemic. It's a year old, eh? And, you know, I hope just hearing it now and thinking about it and living within it in these last few days, I hope this is a book. I mean, I'm amazed at the circulation the book has had so far, and excited by the response that your work is getting from readers all over. And I just hope that this is a book that extends to the furthest audience possible. So thank you for reading it again. I'm going to talk for 2 minutes just because you just did such a to give you a rest for a minute, and just to let people know who are watching presently and in the future that Tanya's reading from Slow Scrape, published by the Documents on Expanded Poetics series that I co-edit with Nathan Brown at the Center for Expanded Poetics at Concordia University. and it's distributed and published with Anteism Books in Montreal. I put a link right at the start of Tanya's reading to the book. Get it while you can. We just did a second printing of it, and the first one went in a matter of few weeks. So so please do get them. It's you've just heard an incredible reading, and so you have a glimpse of what it's like, but it's actually just such a beautiful object. And something that I think that is so incredible that I don't know if one gets the sense of the textual arrangement and the forms of repetition, but this probably doesn't come across, but it's such a, Tanya was reading from the Harvest Dirties earlier, and it's just such a beautiful concrete text. And it's just so incredible on the page. And so I really want people to be able to just luxuriate in the experience to engage this work on the page. And I just want to give back a kind of overview of what we've just heard of this book, because I think it's, Tanya's covering such incredible ground here, moving from Chief Spence and these poems dedicated to her that begin to be in relation to Chief Spence, as Tanya said. And I feel that we're just so lucky to have this poem and these poems and this document to such an incredible figure, such an important figure, someone who I've thought about, throughout these years. I guess that would have been January 2013. I remember the sort of Idle No More movement really kicking into a high tenor at that time, and I think of her, the figure of her, constantly in in all of the important work that people are doing. And I feel that we're so lucky to have Tanya's encountering with the figure of Chief Spence, and the way that moves from the figure of Spence and the question of how do we begin to be in relation, and looking through relatives in the Harvest Dirties, to opening out into a wider community of relations with the event scores that you've heard. I was really moved by the Siminoff and the move from, thinking about these various, like extended dialogue that's happening in the event scores with a number of figures and a number of people who are all involved in the productions of these works, and to the specificity of Siminoff, and how that is directed to the idea of collections, the museum, and the actual humanities fields, and the fields of learning that Tanya is also encountering in these poems, and shifting and changing, and bringing into, there's a poem Tanya read from the Harvest Dirties, in which she quotes an Auntie as saying, talking about the whole concept of our craftsmen, which I think is so important, and something I actually want to talk about with Tanya once we start talking. But the whole concept of our craftsmen is, Tanya is presenting this and showing this and arguing this in her poems, and it's really incredible. She's arguing this against these collections, against the fields of knowledge that allow these collections to be the way they are in the first place. And through that, we go to Afognac to the final scores for the Afognac, and to the final poem, They Fall on the Ground, or They Fall the Ground, excuse me. And so that's just such an incredible arch that's moving through specificities to opening up to moving back into specifics again, and opening up. And it's just such a careful and attentive movement that is created in this book. And I edited this book, and yet I am surprised at how meticulous and how incredibly crafted it is as a work. So I'll end my preamble there just to say thank you for that reading, Tanya. It was really, really, really fabulous. And I'll just ask you, to begin, what's it like to be reading this work, in the world now? I mean, you've been so busy with a number of exhibitions and visual works, and I feel like this past week you've got to be able to come back to this book again in a nice way. And so just curious how it feels for you.
It feels really great. I mean, these works really are, I mean, I didn't intend them for publication. They were sort of living in relation to my practice. They were living in relation to many different kinds of works that I was making over time, from 2011 to 2018. And then, of course, when you asked me about the possibility of the book, I didn't know what it could become, but now I'm so moved by the fact that it has made it home to my villages. There's some in the native village of Port Lions Library, which is very moving to me, that my cousins are reading it, my cousins are responding, my family members are, that's incredibly powerful to me. And that really happened sort of in the first printing. And then coming back to the work right now is incredibly moving, because it was released during the pandemic and there were very few readings, like maybe 2 or 3, not many, although I have read a number of these works over the years as a part of my practice in sort of these performative readings, where I sometimes will have works for camera accompanying the reading. But it was really quiet last year, and rightly so. So to be able to sort of have this, interest in the book now is quite compelling and allows me to sort of enter back into relation with it. And I think that there's something really powerful about that particular relation between myself and between what writing can do. And I am trying to also write my dissertation right now, and it's a really different kind of writing. And I'm actually asking a lot of those questions a lot of the time. Is like, what is my relationship to writing? And I think that is, many people ask that question, but for me, it's really rooted in this idea of relations at large, which is how we are in relation to one another, how we are in relation to water, how we are in relation to treaty, how we are in relation to ideas and to practices and to one another. And I guess I really hold writing sort of in that field, thinking about relations. And so it's been really beautiful to kind of come back into relation with this work right now. And one thing I might mention is, I do want to say that when Chief Teresa Spence fasted, that a number of other people joined her to fast. Like, there were many helpers who were there. There were many people who were caring for her and being in relation to her, praying with her, fasting in their respective communities. And then there were also, this was also sort of when Idle No More, which was happening separately, kind of also sort of gathered some momentum. And I just remember, at Christmas time in shopping malls across Canada and also in the United States, that they were having these round dances. And so a round dance is, it's an activity that it is a ceremony. Like, originally it is a ceremony. Saskatchewan and Alberta, they're are very strong in round dancing. And during my lifetime, I've had the opportunity to attend many round dances and participate. And it was really beautiful because at that moment, at Christmas time in 2012, there was this incredible disruption of capitalism and this like desire to spend and to consume, because people were Indigenous folks and perhaps some allies, although I don't know, were staging these huge round dances and disrupting that. And I remember that it looked like there was like hundreds of people dancing. And then there were also smaller actions that were happening. And all of it was being documented on social media. And so it was this really important moment where, you know, you had mainstream media documenting what was happening with Chief Teresa's Spence, and I was getting those updates all of the time. And then you also had social media, which was sort of sharing and dispersing these images and this documentation of those actions. And it was just a really incredible moment and time to witness. And I really feel that, I mean, there have been, you know, many incredible movements led by Indigenous people and continue to be. But I felt like that moment in particular was really significant in my own life and my own sort of thinking about the world and thinking about how we mobilize and how the actions of some can ripple and affect so many others and sort of instigate this like deep desire to do something. So I have not met Chief Teresa Spence. I just want to clarify that. I've never met her. I think I saw her at the mall here where I live. I really feel I may have seen her at the mall because it's a small town and there's lots of folks, Cree folks who come through. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure it was her. But I don't know her, but I deeply respect what she did. And I deeply respect also my Omuskego Cree relatives and my other relatives who've also done incredible things like Helen Semyonov.
I thank you for citing those round dances in December 2012. I mean, I remember, you know, seeing spaces like Regina and Saskatoon just become these centers of incredible mobilization. And for me, one of the things that was so incredible about that moment was like the seizure of space, you know, from capitalist circulation that was happening there, but also the seizure of the soundtrack. You know, when you think of these spaces and the music that's piped into them, the kind of music that's piped into them in order to facilitate that shopping, you know, and how the music of those round dances and the actual movement of the bodies, it was scintillating to see and exciting to confront this time. Yeah, you know, I think it might be helpful to just you know, not take for granted people know the full concept of your craft, and to cite, you know, how some of the writing or a lot of the writing done. I mean, you mentioned that some of this work began in dialogue and under mentorship with incredible Layli Long Soldier, but just this being part of an art book fair, and to locate your practice within the discourse of this art book fair, I thought it might be nice for you to talk about your whole artistic practice and the relation of these texts to that.
Yeah, so I feel like each of these could be like a number of talks. So maybe I'll, because I covered a lot of ground with the reading today. You know, this work, The Harvest Dirties, became a number of text banners that were installed in a number of places and continue to be installed in a number of places and have circulated. And I used this canvas that kind of felt like the canvas that we might use for a teepee. And I was interested in sort of the way in which documentary poetics and Cree language and the concreteness or the visual aspects of the work could be experienced by a viewer. And so that's why I hadn't necessarily thought so much of them as a publication. I always imagined them as an installation, as coming into being in that way. And then later, I undertook a number of performances where I used the texts as scores for the performance with a number of dancers in different cities, in Vancouver and Minneapolis and Montreal. And that kind of took different iterations. And I feel like my work is somewhat iterative. Sometimes I sort of revisit a project over and over and over again as I experiment and I try things with dancers and I try things in different places. And that sort of led me to the year 2017, which was Canada 150. And, that year there was quite a lot of, clamoring for Indigenous peoples to be a part of exhibitions and so there was a lot of space that was afforded to me in some ways. And I felt that in order to respond, I really needed to speak about or be in relation to treaty, because that really is the sort of, not the only, but a very foundational relationship in Canada and for the formation of Canada to even come into existence. So I was really interested in the sort of Indigenous understandings of treaty, and Chief Teresa Spence embodied that. She was working through a Muskego Cree ceremony, and in order to do what she was doing, she worked through this Indigenous knowledge, this Indigenous practice that's in relation to knowledge. And so I undertook a couple of works called The Treaties in the Body and The Treaties in the Body Sister Video, where I spent time with an Omuskego Cree knowledge holder, Jennifer Wabano, in my home with a group of primarily Omuskego Cree women and girls in order to learn about treaty and to learn Indigenous understandings of it. So Omuskego Cree and Anishinaabe understandings. And that learning also included time with youth dancers, and in any case has sort of gone on to live in many different places in the world, or to be seen. So that's a sort of thread in my work, like a longer sort of research and sort of trajectory of my practice, which is now coming back in these Gookum scarf sculptures. And a Gookum scarf is worn by powwow dancers, so old style jingle dancers, old style fancy dancers, men's grass dancers, but not only those categories of dance. They're also worn by Gookums and Aunties. Like this is they were worn as scarves on the head to cover the hair and the head, and now are also worn by folks like water protectors or people who are in resistance to resource extraction or other sorts of important movements. And so I really wanted to continue this work, and now it's coming into being. So I've had the first sort of iteration of these Gookum scarf sculptures. It's currently on view at Wesleyan at the Zilka Gallery there. And it's called Breastbone to Sunrise. And they're 20 feet tall, and they're about 30 inches wide. And there's 44 of them total. But in this instance, there's only 5. And so I'm really sort of continuing to look at Chief Teresa Spence's embodied action as a way to kind of structure these sort of next installation works that are coming from and citing, that knowledge, that intergenerational knowledge from our grandmothers and from our aunties and from women. And one of the things that I will say is, and we talk about this in the book, is that I do think that knowledge transmission is multi-directional. And so it's also important for youth to be, we learn from youth as well, from children and youth. And And so I think having youth dancers or children and youth dancers in that project, The Treaties and the Body, was really significant because it helped to point to that this knowledge needs to continue, and it needs to be embodied and activated and lived, and we have to be engaging with it in order for it to be in the world. Yeah, that's just one sort of line of my sort of research and production, but I won't really speak about it too much, but I've also been undertaking a number of works in relation to collections and museums and ancestral belongings. And, that's really present for me right now, and something that I'm kind of deep working with as well.
That's great. When I look through the book and also look at the works that you're making now, I think often of a time I was very fortunate to spend with the Dene scholar Lois Edge. Have you ever met this person? I had the incredible luck to have spent about a week with her in Oxford, England, while she was looking at and seeing her ancestors' jackets that were made, I think in Satu, perhaps, in Denede, and very much like the description of Siminoff, your relative, seeing the collection, standing with her at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and her encountering a series of jackets. Like she called them fancy jackets in my mind. I don't know if what the term is for them, but I just talking with her, this would have been 2007, 2008, and talking with her, I never, it hit me for the first time, the textuality of textile practices. This is for a lot of people who work in this and study this. This is an of course moment, but I've never understood until these conversations that I was lucky to have with her, the way in which cultural memory is preserved and circulated and enacted through textiles. And yeah, it's such a profound part of your writing, of the research that you're doing. And I mean, you've spoken about it a little bit here, but just generally, I'm wondering if you can talk for a moment about the relationship for you between your writing practice, or writing practices more generally, and these textile works and garments and of all kinds that you've been looking at.
Yeah, I do know Lois. I knew Lois. I lived in Treaty 6. I lived in Amiskwaciwaskahigan for 9 years in Edmonton, and I knew Lois then, and I saw her maybe a few years ago. So it's amazing, actually, that it's such a small world. And I saw a talk by her where she actually spoke about what you're speaking about right now. She was speaking about, yeah, so this is quite interesting. So I mean, I guess it becomes, it's sort of silly to say, but it's just so apparent how important these texts need to be spoken, and how my practice at large does live in the live encounter, and it lives in orality. It lives in sort of conversation and being in relation with folks. And as a part of that, I've also started to think about this sort of ongoing practice of Alutiiq people to study the material that has been left to us by our ancestors that are in collection storage spaces, or sometimes there's also ongoing archaeological activities on our island. But there's this desire to know something that was left to us by them. So it's a way for them to communicate with us. And I'm not a maker in the way that, you know, so many folks are from my island who have this incredible ability to tan fish skins, which I think is remarkable and so phenomenal, or to harvest and cure the grasses that they use for baskets that they make, incredibly woven, beautiful, beautiful baskets. Or, you know, the fur sewing they do with parkas and other garments, or knowing how to process gut in order to make rain gut parkas. Like, it's just this incredible knowledge that, similar to the women I spoke about early on, Lillian Trapper and Marlene Kapashishit and Agnes Hunter, it's like that. You know, I grew up seeing this incredible work in Alaska. And so when I met my relatives, my Cree relatives here, I thought, oh, I understood this idea of the whole concept of the craftsman, which is that it far exceeds the way in which it's been sort of pinned down, you know, within museums and sort of flattened. And yet, so part of my work, and I think our collective work as Alutiiq people right now, is to investigate the collections, or those who want to do that work. Because when we look at these belongings, these ancestral belongings, there is information there that perhaps only we can discern. And the reason that I say that is because it's in the way in which we look, or in the way in which we are in relation, that we weep, that we sing to them, that we care or have this affective response and relationship and responsibility to them. Because I have had many conversations with collections storage folks, with collections managers and other folks, and I'm not sure how they do the work because of the pure volume, you know, of belongings that they're encountering on a regular basis. But also, I think that for myself, it would be incredibly, like, it would be a great deal of emotional labor, you know, being in relation to that many belongings and I can't imagine it, to be quite honest. Because when I enter into those spaces, I'm sensing, I feel that I'm sensing perhaps the energetic qualities of the work, you know, of those belongings. I'm sensing, my mind is in this place sort of simultaneously where I'm thinking about the work that went into make this and how it was removed from our homelands and sort of displaced and dispossessed. And yet here I am coming back to be in relation to it. So it's complicated. There's many things happening simultaneously. And so obviously I'm still trying to find the language to sort of explain or communicate what that is. To get to this idea of what is being communicated, I mean, textuality to me is a kind of reductive word because I feel as though it's more complex than that. It's more dynamic than that. It's the energetic qualities. It's that which you can't see, but you can feel and sense and decipher. And so that's part of my work as an Alutiiq person in relation to these belongings. And of course, what I sense and what I notice and what I see is going to be different from someone else from my community, which is going to be different from someone else from another village on my island, or from someone who's a maker who is going to understand the material in a different way than I will. So I'm continuing to do this work and to think a little bit about these belongings, partly as scores for performance. So I'll leave it at that because I've spoken a great deal about this and I think we might have some questions.
That's great. Yeah, I just want to say that your point about the textuality being reductive is something that I'm really going to think on. Is, you know, there's such a large body of theory that is trying to turn everything into a form of textuality, and it's just throwing the textuality out there. So I think that this is an incredibly prescient point. to consider further. I'm going to read the question from the attendee. Is that okay? I've been thinking about how poetry matters. Both has significance through making change in the world, but also it has actual volume, weight, materiality. I wonder if you have thoughts about the relationship of your work to both making change and also through having a sense of materiality.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. Like, you know, I think in some regards, for me, this work is all about the relational, you know, as I've said earlier. And so I can't always know what the outcomes are. I can't certainly understand when I set out to undertake a project where I'm kind of asking questions about the world, and I'm asking questions about lived experience by women and other folks that I deeply respect. I can't always know the outcomes, and I don't want to overdetermine that. In fact, I think that if I already know the answer and I already know what I want the work to do, then I'm not actually doing the work. That I need to sort of take this on as a kind of inquiry into the world, a sort of inquiry into my relationship with folks, you know, like family members, relatives who've passed away, youth, community members, my ancestors. So there's these sort of ethical, but kind of also speculative components of the work. And I guess that's how I think about writing generally. Is it's also a way for me to find a way through what it is that I'm facing in this particular moment, or I'm thinking about in this particular moment. And so, you know, there's like lots of folks who talk about, you know, how utterances have power and enact things in the world. And I think that they do. I think that even from an Alaska Native perspective, like we have to be careful what we say in the world, because there is power tied up in that, and it affects others, and it can shift so much. And so we have to be mindful of what we say and how we say it. And you know, when I was very young and I was reading Joy Harjo's work, that was also became very, very clear to me. And that was quite formative. So it's not that it's not that I don't think that poetry has this sort of power in the world, because it does. And we have to be sort of mindful and careful or cautious about what it is that we say, or we need to realize that there will be effects in the world. But I also think I give myself the space to sort of ask questions through it also.
I'll add on to that too. That's something that I see that is so valuable in your work. Is you used the phrase the other day that making people, forcing people, and this is a material circumstance of actually listening and engaging, reading your work and listening to it, that one has to sit with the uncomfortableness of not knowing. And that is, you know, most explicit, say, in the Alutiiq and Cree passages in the book, when one has to sit with and engage the not knowing, and maybe trying to form some kind of contextual understanding of what these things may signify, what these sounds may signify if you're reading. But that experience is actually a material realization of a kind of epistemology that you're modeling in the work itself, which is really valuable. And it goes back to something you've talked about before, which is you know, creating material circumstances of non-extractive listening and non-extractive engagement. And that's something that I'm so incredibly thankful for, and something that has really enriched my thinking of, as a model and example of what this practice may be or look like, feel like,
Yeah, I mean, I think, Dylan Robinson has written extensively about hungry listening, and he's absolutely affected my thinking about some of these ideas about what listening is. But I couple that with my own sort of lived experience, kind of my long-term engagement with listening as a practice, listening to family members, listening to elders and Indigenous knowledge holders, where sometimes they'll repeat and repeat and repeat these ideas. But there's a way we enter into relation with them through that repetition. There's a way that I think about now some of those ideas later in life. I think about them in very different ways than when I first encountered them when I was very young. And that's significant. I also think that, I have a long practice of working with dancers and sort of listening with the whole body, listening with my body, listening to their bodies. Like I'm trying to listen to the nonverbal, the ways in which they're communicating through embodiment. And then with the ancestral belongings, they have bodies, they have energetic qualities, they can't speak to me. And so how do I listen to them? How do I listen to them in ways that, whereas, people have that sort of agency that's very evident to sort of direct our attention to what it is that they want us to see, the belongings don't necessarily have that same, we don't have that same relationship to them, or I'm not going to suggest that they don't have agency, because I think some of them do. But it's a different kind of listening, and it's a different kind of like patience. Yeah, anyways, that was a great question and a great sort of conversation, Michael.
My pleasure. Are there any, if anybody else has any, I see something just popped up into the chat. Thank you for so generously offering your experiences and opening out such powerful questions. Truly, that's from S. Hollis Mickey. I feel like I could talk to you all day. Oh, there's a long question, and we'll take this and after that, let's maybe call it just, it's Friday night in the world. And you've been so incredibly generous. I'll read the question from W. Mitchell. Thank you so much for this reading. The book is such a gorgeous gift on its own on the page, and it was such a pleasure to hear you read some of it aloud. I would love to know more from you about your understanding of relationship and collaboration with those names, artists, makers, relatives, scholars in your text. The sheer number of names itself being a prominent feature of the book. I mean, it's an incredible fact of the book. It's like it brings you into this incredible citational field. Just to comment on the question, I love it. I was so struck by how you figured your relationship with Chief Spence as an activity rather than a fact that one can undertake a kind of beginning to be in relation to as a kind of rich and responsible and physical work. I'd like to invite you to share more of that concretely. You understand the labor of coming into relation to be. And how does physically or actively making with or performing these event scores versus reading these poems bring you into relationship?
Wow, I feel like this is going to take me some time to reflect on. And I'm one of those folks that sometimes when an idea is posed, it takes me time to sort of sit with it and kind of process it and sort of be with it and then and then make a decision about how I respond. And so I think that one of the things I'm cautious about is, you know, when I'm speaking about Maria Tallchief or Dylan Robinson or Sheriff Rossett or Edgar Heap of Birds or any of these folks, Eve Tuck, I have a relationship with them. In fact, some of them I know in real life. In fact, some I do and some I don't. Maria Tallchief has passed away. And I suppose what I'm pointing towards is the sort of labor involved in building relationships, but also building relationships to texts or to works of art or to histories, that there is a responsibility to sort of learn, and that in a way I'm inviting the reader to, by naming these folks, I'm naming the readers to undertake their own sort of relationship building with the ideas that are being posed by these phenomenal writers and cultural producers. So Eve Tuck and Dylan Robinson and Sherry Farrell Rossett are incredibly prolific. You know, they have a sort of history of writing, all three of them. And Edgar Heap of Birds has a phenomenal, you know, practice, artistic practice. So in those event scores, there are different audiences that I'm engaging. And one of the audiences that I'm engaging is a settler audience, a non-Indigenous audience. And so I think that currently within the context of reconciliation, oftentimes there's this desire on the part of a settler audience to sort of go to Indigenous people and ask Indigenous people to do a lot of labor in terms of explaining culture or histories or legacy of Indian residential schools or just whatever the case might be. And what I'm proposing in those event scores is a kind of concision and refusal to do that labor for others. That is the work that I've undertaken over the course of my lifetime. And so now, what is your responsibility? If you want to be in relation to Indigenous people and Indigenous ideas and Indigenous, our shared histories, which are, you know, everyone is implicated in on Turtle Island, which is North America, or then that's a part of the labor that is not my responsibility. I've been doing it, and I'm going to continue to do it. But how are you as the reader going to take that work up? So that's sort of part of a response to this question. And I think that, you know, also in terms of Chief Tree Suspense, I can't necessarily respond directly to the political action and the sort of ceremonial activities that she undertook, but what I can respond to, or the way in which I chose to respond, was to fortify those relationships with women that I deeply respect, who are my extended relatives, to learn more about their lives and to learn more about their relationship to Treaty 9, which is the same treaty that Chief Tree Suspense, where her community or her First Nation is located in. And so, because I'm not going to ask that labor of Chief Tree Suspense, I'm not going to demand that of her, I'm not going to have an extractive relationship with her. I'm going to, in a good way, with consent from my relatives, ask if they want to be a part of sharing about their lived experience, as a way for me to learn. So there's an incredibly beautiful sort of intergenerational and pedagogic component of that text in particular. I think that's maybe as far as I'll go with sort of a response to that complex question.
I was just typing in the chat that it was a great question. Thank you. The other day you made a comment about how you were working with one of the dancers on a piece that you're doing choreography for, and you're describing the different relations that the dancers have to the scoring that you offer them, and how one dancer described the text as being open enough so that I can find my way into it. And that is such an incredible, if I could describe what the genre is that you're working in Slow Scrape, that is it. You're creating these openings, a textual, cultural, relational space that is open enough so that someone can find their way into it, and there is responsibility and an openness and a generosity, but also a call to, and Layli writes beautifully about this call in her prologue to the book, this call towards action. And yeah, I feel so lucky. We've talked about this book a lot, Tanya, but I feel like in these conversations that I'm learning so much more about it, and I'm so thankful to be a part of something that continues to live and generate and excite in this way. So thank you so much for reading tonight. Thank you so much for your incredibly generous replies. Thank you to everyone listening and watching tonight, and for your questions. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to Volume for having us here.
Well, Quiana, Michael, for all of your generosity and for being in relation. A book is not a small undertaking, so it's been really great to have you on this journey, of bringing this book into being and to a broader audience. And I look forward to continued conversation about it and continued visiting.
I do too. Thank you so much, Tanya. I feel so lucky.
Thanks so much to both of you. That was really moving reading, Tanya, and the conversation brought in all these other layers of insight. With Volume, I'm really trying to hope to bring long life and ongoing discussions into books and writing by artists. And I'm just so pleased that you two were able to speak to us tonight. And thank you so much for this. It was absolutely generous on both of your behalf. For the people who have joined us on the Zoom, thank you so much. We will be having other programming throughout October. There's several other readings scheduled, and the best way to find out about them is through our social medias and the Volume MTL .art website. This talk and other talks from this series will be posted on YouTube shortly with French language subtitles. So if you want to revisit some of this conversation and reading, it will be available for that. Thanks again to our reader and interlocutor. What a great start for the weekend. And thanks again for everybody for joining us. And I hope you will be able to check out some of our other online programming. All right, good evening.